Down here. Still passed out from the new stuff shown in the direct. Okay, so what are we going to be making according to our schedule? You told me that way too big diorama of the Octobot King II, right? Huh. Okay, fine. Let's first go and add these reference sheets together just to see how big this thing's going to become. Holy Zapfish, I think Arena might be right. Maybe we do need to extend our room with the amount of dioramas we have here now. But no turning back. So after that, we also need to attach the pieces for the big patterns together. So that we can cut these out. And use them on the first of many foam board sheets for this project. With many of these circle patterns serving as the truncated cones around the Octobot. Next, I had to mark out a 45cm circle to be able to mark out the circumference around the big centerpiece of this project. This 50cm wide styrofoam ball. By having these markings on the circle, I was able to center out the piece, and using a level, I was able to make sure the sheet was horizontal to mark out the line that I had to next go and cut out. Because first we had to go and use the other cones for the assembly of the big booster at the bottom of the final boss. But not stacking the cones up high like normal, but by interlocking the pieces we get this telescope effect. After that part had been made, I could then add the big cone to the transition to the front of the machine. By adding the hot glue to the foam board instead of the styrofoam ball, it allows the glue to cool down a bit before it officially touches the styrofoam, as the glue straight out of the gun would easily melt the foam. With the cone added, we could then mark it out on the leftover piece to make the backing for the two stages that we will later need to add to the diorama. With this line marked, we could then cut it straight down and trim the edges before we can sand it smooth. After which I then fill the crease with hot glue and let that cool to fuse the two pieces together. But the back half of the sphere also needs some attention. For this half of the sphere, I used my reference sheets to be able to mark out the endpoints for this curve that comes through the back of the machine. These endpoints I then connected to make the line that I now needed to cut through. With a steady hand and by going slow, much slower than shown in the video, I was able to cut out the line, which now allows me to sand the open edge to a smooth surface with some 400 grit sandpaper. And by using the other half of the cut as a placeholder, I can then mark out where I can place the good half onto the front of the diorama. But an open back just won't do for this project. So we use some 5mm EVA foam to be able to cut out these pieces. After which we can then glue them together using some contact cement. And this will then allow us to make a little bit more than a quarter of a 45cm wide circle for the inside of the bag. And while we have the glue out and the filter mask on, we can also glue the 4 pieces of each of the arms together. These 22cm high eggs that I had patterned off of a small styrofoam egg and had sized up on my computer to get the pattern that I needed for these 2 bases of the arms. After which I could finally start to make the 2 stages for our custom amiibo. First up was Evil Callies. I started with 2 ovals which I had glued together with a 2.5cm wide strip for some more thickness to this piece. After which I then needed to add a little bit more EVA foam for a quarter of a 22cm wide sphere that will make the background for our stage. So after a little bit more cutting, heat shaping and gluing, I was able to attach this sphere to the back of our stage together with a 5mm wide strip of foam board for a bit more strength since the sphere has not been completed yet. So after marking out the placement, I could then hot glue the background to the stage. Next was DJ Octavios. For this I started with a flat base of 2 circles crossing together. Then I added a 3cm wide strip of bent foam board for the back of his turntable. And then for the front, I had figured out this truncated cone pattern, which I then cut out and bent. And this I then added to the front of his stage. After which I added more glue to the tops of the edges and pressed the stage onto another piece of foam board to make the top of the turntable, which I then needed to carefully cut out since I didn't want to cut into the upright parts of the table. And so after a bit of trimming and some sanding on the open edges, and a little circle was placed for the amiibo holder to be a bit higher, and some final pieces of XPS foam were placed for the holders of the Wasabi sticks, we had both bases for the stages ready. So next we had to make the wrist for the machine. Using 2 sizes of half the rings of styrofoam onto a 5cm high piece of XPS foam, I glued the pieces together. But first gluing the bigger ring onto the XPS sheet and then adding some more glue to the edge of the smaller ring, I was able to make another telescope effect using these pieces. After which I then needed to cut out the XPS foam and needed to add a 22° angle to the foam to make it match up to the base of the arms, which we had originally made from EVA foam. Speaking of which, now I needed to prepare these for the wrists. For this I first needed to cut out the top to make a flat surface to glue the foam onto. And for this surface I had already prepped a circle of foam board to glue onto the open top of the arm. So with that surface added, we could then add the glue and attach the bottom of the wrists to the arms. And finally, we could add the big partial sphere of EVA foam to the inside of the back of the Octobot. But as you can see, the sphere doesn't really quite cover all of the open surfaces of the back. So for this, we marked a pattern for just how far they reached into the sphere and then cut out 2 more pieces for each side to fill out those open areas. And with that, we could finally start to work on some more of the details of the diorama. Like a chance to start to work on the speakers that can be found all over the Octobot King II. Although now that I'm thinking about it, it is kind of a DJ station, so it's fair. For these we luckily only first needed to make some boxes. So this meant a lot of cutting of 45-degree angles. After which we can then assemble the 6 small speakers that will go around Cali's stage. These 2 big speakers together with 2 smaller ones that can be found in the back of the video for the top of the Octobot. And then these 2 white speakers for the front, which will also be the cookers for the takoyaki balls. But for these cookers we do actually need those balls. So for these I had pierced and glued some wooden balls onto a dowel to let the former beads have a solid core. After which I needed to cut the skewer into 2. And sand the halved balls. After which we could then add 12 to each of the 2 cookers. Next are all of the controls for the turntable. These 2 big wooden circles of 6mm MDF together with 2 circles of 2mm EVA foam as the spindles. And a lot of little 5mm EVA foam pieces for all of the knobs and sliders around the table. And finally some pearly gems together with some other emeralds as the buttons to finish off the table. And from one stage to the next, with us adding this decorative strip of EVA foam to the top of her stage. This then allows us to add these XPS foam speakers around this strip. After which we then needed to add some more gems to this other 5mm EVA foam strip. With a 3cm interval, these are added to the front of the stage. And so we come to the make or break of this project. Time we get to start to add all of these pieces together. Starting simply with the attachment of DJ Octavio's stage. Just straight up in the front, nothing special about it. But with the conclusion of that we get to one of the most difficult ones, the attachment of Cali's stage. For this I first needed to cut out the precise hole where the stage is going to need to sit. So with this pattern for the front of the stage and a lot of nerves, I slowly started to carve away at the styrofoam to first make the space for the base of the stage. After which then came the hardest part by getting the two spheres to meet as nicely as they do in the 3D model. And so, to get a bit of a break from the front, I decided to do some work on the back to get it ready to be added to the front. But first adding a ring of foam board around the EVA foam addition to make it more sturdy and to have it line up better once I start to add it to the front. But first hot gluing the edges and the middle of the circle, I could then slowly start to add the extra support along the rest of the foam board piece. But even I'm not perfect. So I had to make up for my mistakes by adding some more filler to the open edges, cuts, etc. Which after drying also need to be sanded back to be able to keep the smooth appearance of the Octobot King II. This is an especially good time to do this, because after this we're going to need to attach the two halves together, which will make it a lot harder without a flat surface to lay the diorama onto. And after sucking up all of the dust, we can attach the two halves. With some wood glue for the styrofoam onto styrofoam parts. And some more hot glue for the foam board to styrofoam parts. Making sure to let the glue cool down a bit as to not immediately melt all of the foam. And while that dried, I was able to draw and cut out this bottom for the diorama onto some NDF, which can now be added to the bottom of the sphere. This will not only add some stability to the diorama, but this will also allow us to have a place where we can add the booster that we made at the beginning of the project. So let's fill that up by first making a pattern using some pieces of masking tape. After which we can then trace the pieces onto some foam board and glue this with tapered edges into the open areas. And with the glue now being fully dry, the same as the filler I added later, I needed to do a little bit more sanding on the diorama. And finally, we get the main reasons for the wooden plates. I wanted to add these acrylic rods to the underside of the Octobot. With these rods, I wanted to have the diorama appear floating above a platform. So for this, I did need to have a sturdy base to drill into. And so after these rods are added, I needed to attach the two arms of the Octobot. With a lot of hot glue and by adding it evenly along multiple layers, I was slowly but surely able to attach both arms to both sides of the machine. Next up are the cookers again, since I still needed to attach the two halves together. And I still needed to add these three little tubes between them. So by using some paper straws, I was able to glue these between the two speakers, strengthening the bond of these two even more than just the hot glue that I had let drip into the back seam. Next, a little bending of some 4mm wires, just bending by hand, nothing special, making two halved circles. which, after drilling their appropriate holes into the smaller speakers, get to be the setup that will be placed around Kelly's stage. And as the last of the speakers to be attached, we cut yet another hole into the Octobot. After which we can attach the two big speakers with their smaller counterparts into the diorama. Then for some final decorations we have these 3D printed lights for around Kelly's stage that I did need to print in two pieces. So after gluing the two halves together again and having the smaller speakers already added, we can superglue the smaller setup around the inside of the dome, and then the big setup can be added with a dab of superglue behind each of the spotlights. Then at last we can hot glue the cookers to the front of the diorama, and with all of these loose parts added, I could at last connect them with these flexible tubes with some 3D printed bases for each end. Next were these 3D printed canisters for the poster tube, which I then needed to put on, mark out each length, and cut on the jigsaw. And this was then repeated for all 8 with their 4 different sizes, which then needed to be added to all of these different attachment holes around the diorama. By taking really good care during the cutting of these holes to also remember which way I want the exhaust to face, I was able to attach all 8 around the diorama. And so we glue the final 3D printed bases and tubes to connect to the exhausts. With some more 3D printed details via the use of these 3D printed speaker faces that we can then add to these former boxes. And finally I add these decorative strips around all of the speakers. And I add these different sized gems onto the big and small top speakers for some more decorative detail. And with the final bit of crafting done on the Octobot, I could then finally add it to this cardboard mold that I had lined with some duct tape. Then I could add the cement for a strong and sturdy base. I plan to do this first with a thicker layer that I will make according to recommendation. And then a second layer that I would make more watery to flow into a smooth surface. Yeah, that didn't work at all. So better to just try and smooth it out by hand according to the recommendations on the packaging next time. But after a lot more time that we had to wait because we made it too watery, we did have the final part of the diorama finished. So we could at last start painting this machine. So for this I first had to add a primer coating of a black acrylic paint, Mod Podge and the last of my wood glue to make the ultimate primer for styrofoam parts. This is because next we went over the entire diorama with a black spray paint. And if we didn't cover the styrofoam extensively like we did, all of the foam surfaces would have melted. And because we were prepared, we can now continue with the primer onto the cement base without any worries. On top of which we can then add these fun little markings, which can also be found in the arena where you fight DJ Octavio at the end of the game. Then it was finally the turn to be able to do something with these 3D printed hands for the diorama. These things were just collecting dust since the start of the project. But now we can at last give them some attention with a nice coat of gold paint on all of the armor pieces. After which I could then add the pink highlights to the circles around the fingers and the lights at the bottom of the hand. And off camera I also added the gunmetal details to the hinges between the fingers. And lastly, these Octarian letters are also added to the knuckles cut out from some craft paper and then superglued on. Finally, I could add the first colors to the diorama using a dark metallic acrylic paint for the highlights on the flexible tubes and the bases of the arms, Kelly's stage, the top of DJ Octavio's turntable and the cookers. Also adding it to the edges of the decorations and the edges and the middle of the smaller speakers around Kelly's stage. And lastly, I used the dark metallic paint for this big Octo logo that I wanted to add to the back of the Octobot King II. Next are some more golem details around the diorama. Details like the big circles on the wrists and these little decorations on the other end of the arms. And the edges on the speakers on the cookers. Then I used a bit of black felt for the faces of the speakers around the edges of Kelly's stage. And remember that Octo from the back? I also added a purple version to the floor on Kelly's stage. Then I could finally add the bright red for the labels around the speakers. With this square script for the name, and the little sea bunny squid logo for the faces of the speakers. Finally, I could also add the sandy brown to the takoyaki balls. And of course, not forgetting about the nice sauce that DJ Octavio has already added while they're still in the pan. Well, I'm just here to add the dark brown for the sauce and not complain about his poor cooking skills. After the takoyaki, we use even more gold paint on the script for the flag that DJ Octavio has hanging underneath Kelly's stage. But by adding a primer of black to the script that we needed to add, we can save a whole lot of gold paint that would otherwise just get sucked into the fabric. So while the fabric dries, I started on the many wasabi sticks. Starting with a white primer I added through the airbrush. Then a jungle green for the tops of the sticks. Followed by a snake green mixed with a little bit of dark green for the bottoms of the sticks. And to finish them off, I mixed a jungle green with a mummy's robes and added this white greenish to the tops of the sticks and to randomly add the warts that cover the wasabi sticks. Then after a lot of white metallic primer to add, I could use a silver acrylic paint to paint all of the 8 exhausts. And this same silver, but then with a black base, was then also added to the booster at the bottom. To this booster and the spindles and the controls, I then added a green paint to bring out some more color into the stage. Rounding off the project, I wanted to try and add the backlighting of the stage with my airbrush. Shamefully enough, that didn't work. So I had to resort to getting a cotton swab and adding each spot of the lights in the back by hand. Finally, I added these 3D printed exhaust gases that I had painted with the airbrush. And I added the group of 6 wasabi sticks to each side of DJ Octavio's turntable setup. Then I added the right fist. Next, the flag was added underneath Evil Kelly's stage. And the left fist was added, mid-attack using some aluminium tube that I bent into kind of a spiral and painted with the same gold color as the rest of the diorama. And so, with all of the stuff done around the diorama, I could finally remove the masking tape around the acrylic rods. And move the diorama into place into my room. And with that finally done, I can announce the Octobot King II diorama finished.
Hey Creagears, Robert here, and we hope you enjoyed this a bit too long video. It feels so good to have the Octobot King II finally done after almost a month of work. This was also the reason why we needed to skip one video this month. I was very sorry about that happening. But to make it up to you guys, we can confirm that we have some very nice Splatoon 3 projects planned for our next videos. Customs, plushies, and even another diorama. But let's wait with that one just a little bit. That's for sure. So, we hope to see you guys then. Keep those Creagears turning, and we will see you guys in the next video.